All right, everyone. We are going to get started. It is 12:01. And welcome to another webinar, our second in our Fall Lunch and Learn series for 2021. Thank you for joining all of our panel and CCI Huronia today. Good afternoon. My name is Sonja Hodis. I'm one of the many directors at CCI Huronia, as well as a condo lawyer and your moderator today. Today, we are going to be learning about what we should and shouldn't do based on what's happened in the past. And although Eleanor Roosevelt, I don't think she ever lived in a condo or managed a condo, she did once say that learning from the mistake of others is important because you can't live long enough to make them all yourself. So today, we are going to take her advice. We are going to learn from the mistakes of others, and our panel lineup today is going to take you through some case studies of real life situations that they've encountered and give you some tips and tricks on what you should and shouldn't do. So we're going to go from construction holdbacks to notice of violations under the fire code to safety concerns around residents and dealing with them, balcony repairs, and the importance of bringing in the right experts and knowing who is actually doing your audit. So our lineup of speakers, we have Jessica Laker from Bayshore Property Management, Mike Tindale from Pretium Engineering, Jon Juffs from Macintosh Perry, Debbie Dale from MCRS Property Management, Michele Farley from FCS Fire Consulting Services, and Blair Spinney, who is our resident auditor. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining me today. Information about our speakers will be posted in the chat box, thanks to Debbie Dale, who's going to be our chat box master, along with their contact information. And feel free to post any comments or questions in the chat box as well. Before we get started, though, I do need to make sure that we take this time to thank our sponsors. And you'll see their logos up on the screen there. I want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Integrity Property Management, FCS Fire Consulting Services, and the Lee Associates Condominium Lawyers. As always, we would like to extend our thanks to them because without the sponsors, we're not able to offer these webinars free of charge. So thank you once again to the generous support of our sponsors. In case this is your first time with us on one of our webinars and you don't know who CCI is, CCI, or the Canadian Condominium Institute, is an independent nonprofit organization formed in 1982. We have chapters across the country, and in Ontario alone, we have 8 chapters. CCI Huronia is one of those Ontario chapters. And probably for the next month and a half, we will still be the current winner of the Lauren Young Chapter of the Year Award for Tier 1. CCI's main objective is education, and that's not all we do, though. We also advocate for condos, and we represent all those involved in condos, from owners to directors to professionals, and we encourage all of these stakeholders to work together. If you're not a member of CCI and you want to enjoy the benefits of membership, check out one of your local chapters and consider joining today. You can find your local chapter at cci.ca, which is our national website. And if you'd like to be a member of the CCI Huronia chapter, you can go to our website at ccihuronia.com and you can register online for membership. The other good thing about the cci.ca website is there is a CCI National Resource Center that is available, and it has a great deal of material available for your review in relation to condo and strata related issues. And you can access that resource center on the national website, cci.ca, or you can go to the CCI Huronia website, ccihuronia.com, and access the resource center from our website directly. Don't forget to follow and like CCI Huronia on Facebook, and that's a great place to find out about our upcoming events. Also check out our website from time to time to know what's going on. And you can also get a copy of our new newsletter called Condo Buzz on our website. If you'd like to join our mailing list and get emails about releases of our newsletter or upcoming events, you can send an email to admin@ccihuronia.com, and we will be more than happy to add you to our mailing list. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, we do post the recordings on our website, ccihuronia.com, under the resource content tab, and just look for past webinars. And when you watch our webinars, be sure to subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and share them with your friends. couple of reminders before we get started. I just ask everybody to keep their mics muted or your phone muted if you're listening through your phone. And we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available on our website next week. So in order to get the best recording available, we ask that if you're not a speaker, just shut your camera off and keep your mics muted. If you're having any trouble with the connection, just end the meeting, log in again. And as a last resort, you can always log in by phone, and all those details would have been in the email you received with the login information. We will be taking live questions from our speakers at the end of the webinar. However, the chat box is always open, and feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat box. Our speakers will be monitoring that chat box, and we'll be trying to answer questions throughout the webinar as best as we can. In terms of our last sort of housekeeping matter is our disclaimer about today's information. The information you're being provided today is general information. It may not apply to your specific fact situation. If you are a condo director and you want to use the protection of Section 37 of the Condominium Act, you do need to get an opinion about your specific situation from your own professionals. This webinar is not intended to provide you with opinions that protect you under Section 37. In addition, the information provided today is current as of October 22nd, 2021. Things change rapidly, and the information provided today may not be relevant or applicable at a future date. So also please check with your professionals to make sure that any information you received in this webinar is still current and applies to your situation. In addition, we do have people who watch these webinars who are outside of Ontario. So this is just a reminder that any references to the Condo Act or other legislation is referenced to Ontario legislation. And if you are from another province, check with your local professionals to make sure that it applies to you as well. So let's get started with our first case study. And we've got Jessica Laker, who's a property manager. And Jessica, you're going to give us some lessons about how to protect yourself, whether you're a property manager or a director with sometimes volatile owners. So why don't you start us off and take us away?
Thank you, Sonja, and thank you, everybody. I always look forward to doing these webinars with everyone. Today, I'm actually going to talk about something a little bit different than what you probably would expect at this webinar. I'm going to talk about a case of assault that actually happened to me personally as a condominium manager quite a few years back. But it's an important lesson to learn that things can happen anytime, anywhere, and we need to keep our heads up and be cognizant of these situations. So my case study is about being a manager in a high-rise building in Thornhill. And sometimes we have these owners that we might know could be a bit of a challenging owner or have caused maybe some mischief in the building. And one of those owners decided to come pay me a visit one day in my office. So he came into the office, and all he wanted that day was to get a new building key for the building. Well, most condominiums, if you're asking for a replacement key for the front door, there is a charge. Now, part of our jobs as condominium managers is enforcement, and there is a cost that comes along with an additional key. It was a high security key, a Medico key. The cost is $50. So he came in and asked for a new key to the building. I said, not a problem at all. The cost will be $50, and I'm happy to give you a key. He said, I'm not giving you any money. And me, who's the enforcer in the condo and likes to stick by the rules, well, then you're not getting the key. Well, then he said, I'm sorry, but you're going to give me the key. I said, I apologize, but I'd be happy to give you the key when you pay for the key. So this escalated, and I should have, in retrospect, I should have had somebody else join me in the office. I was by myself with him. He got very angry, and he jumped over my desk and hit me with his cane. I will take this back a moment. You wonder, being hit with a cane, what kind of condition was this man in? This gentleman actually would walk through our lobbies with a cane, sometimes in a wheelchair, sometimes with a walker, or sometimes jogging with your latest, greatest Nike Airs on his feet. So we know that he played the game a little bit of a bit of a manipulator of the situation, of trying to get a little bit of sensitivity from us, thinking that he, could not walk where he very well could. So he jumped over my desk, hit me with his cane. I moved to the side. Luckily, it hit my leg, not my head that he was intending for. I grabbed my walkie-talkie. It was a little bit old school times then, and called for my superintendent to come to the office. He took off, and I then called the police. A little bit rattled, a little bit shaken up, not overly too badly injured, a mark on my leg, it was sore, but the police showed up and they, talked about the information with me. They then went to his unit, which he was not there. They left a note that he had to turn himself in the next morning by 9 a.m. He also had restrictions given to him when he did show up at the police station the next morning. He did go, and that he could come nowhere near me. He could send nobody to come see me. He could not phone me. No one on his behalf could phone me. And we went on with our business. Slowly, people start showing up at the office with flowers, with wine, with cards. He's so sorry. He's so sorry. He didn't mean to do that. He understands there's rules. Will you please drop this case with the police? Well, the police had every intention of charging him with assault. He, as I said, he wasn't allowed to come near me, but then all of a sudden he shows up at my door one day. I didn't call the police in the first matters that happened with people calling on his behalf or showing up on his behalf. But when he showed up at my door again, and by this point, I should say, I was now keeping my office door closed with the blinds up so I could see who was coming to my office, which I never did before. I always had an open door policy, but because my safety had been jeopardized, I felt that this is what I needed to do. So through the door, I asked him to please leave. I called the police. They came back and they arrested him, took him away in handcuffs, and he spent the next 5 nights in jail. Nobody would come and bail him out, so to speak. And going through this process now, this was now in the hands of the police and a court case. 2 years in court, we ended up. Our day of our date of court in York Region, he asked for an interpreter in the morning, which he actually spoke perfect English. After the lunch break, he told the judge he didn't want the interpreter anymore. And the judge said, you speak English, and wasted the taxpayers' money for an interpreter. So this was a gentleman that played the system in many facets in the condo as well. And I knew that ahead of time. So really, I should have thought through this more clearly of how I was handling myself with him. He got, the end of the day, he got charged with assault with a weapon, went on his record. 5 days in jail was time served. They asked if I wanted a restraining order. I said no, because they had to disclose my home address to him. So I decided that I didn't want that. And on we went. He has a record to this day. And, what transpired could have 100%, in my opinion, now in retrospect, been avoided. The takeaway from this is that don't ever put yourself in a position where possibly someone can get angry, upset. I never thought it could escalate to a physical assault, but it can. And especially when you're dealing with someone who you already know has a bit of a history. I should have just given him the key, and then after the fact, written a letter, you're responsible for this charge, and I could have pursued it in other ways. But, we as condominium managers, we want to try to enforce the rules. We want to try to collect what we're supposed to. But the lesson out of this is never put yourself in jeopardy. And this was 2 years of my time and, emotional destruction on my part that now I was leery. I always had an open door. Now I didn't at this point forward. It's changed now again. It's quite some years later. But a takeaway to board members, residents, colleagues, other professionals, that you don't know when somebody just may snap, and you would least expect it. And unfortunately, I was the victim of that. And I've been very careful with myself ever since in making certain decisions and how I handle myself in these situations. And just a little case study today on being careful and, always choose the safe route for yourselves, because you really never know what could happen.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks for sharing that very personal story. And it's none of that was worth $50 at the end of the day. And there would have been other ways to try and get that $50 from the owner that wouldn't have put you in jeopardy. So it's a very good lesson for property managers and for board members, and even just owners who are interacting with people throughout the condominium, that sometimes it's just not worth it. And there's always another venue to try and resolve things. So thanks again, Jessica, for sharing that and that tip. All right. So now we're going to move on. We're going to sort of do a flip kind of totally in a different direction. And we're going to move over to Mike, who is going to do a case study with respect to the new construction rules that are in place, that have been in place for about, I think, about a year or so. And his case study, Mike, I think you're going to talk about the new construction rules in terms of the holdback.
Right. Yeah, it's partially in the holdback, and it's partially just the changes to the payment process, both with regular payments and the holdback payments. In order to make it's difficult to make this a case study per se, because the way I want to talk about it is in a various scenarios through the different progressions from the old Construction Lien Act to the current Construction Act, and finally touch base with the new CCDC 2020 that's out. So in all of the scenarios, we'll work on the basis that it's a project that is in progress. It's typically the same project in each scenario. The owner or contractor have a bit of a strained relationship that deteriorates a bit as the project goes along. So we're starting at sort of a 10-month project with the contractor, and where he's submitting his invoice for payment. In this case, I'll use June 1st. The contract requires them to send us the draft first for review. They don't bother doing this. We get the draft and we disagree with the amount that they've claimed and send it back to the contractor to get them to adjust their claim. After a couple of exchanges back and forth, we agree on the amount of the invoice. On, say, June 5th, we send out our payment certificate to you, to the board, for payment on the 10th. And the contract allows us about 10 days to review and certify the invoice, gives you, the owner, 20 days from the time we accept their invoice to process it, which is a total of about 20 days, and you issue your payment to the contractor. The back and forth, due to the back and forth with it, it's an extended period of time. Contractor's really not happy with the delay, but that's the process that's in place. When we near getting closer to the end of the project, the contractor will apply for substantial performance in order to get their holdback. We go to the site, we evaluate the work. Everyone agrees that the work substantially performed. When we issue the certificate of substantial performance, they publish it, and this starts the 45-day lien period. During that process, they're supposed to be getting their project documentation together and continuing to finish up the work. We're getting up to 44 days before in the lien period, they're ready to release payment. Work's not completed or improved significantly, and none of the project documentation has been submitted. So the third contractor is basically told that you're not prepared to release their holdback until you get the documentation. This isn't in keeping with the requirements of the Act, but it wasn't an uncommon situation under the conditions at the time. Often the contractor would complain about the delay, but eventually the work would get done, the documents would get released. But it ended up with basically an unhappy situation for everybody involved. To try and remedy some of this, the Construction Act was introduced, which came into effect in part in July of 2018. And if we go back and carry on with sort of the same scenario, the changes to the Construction Act affected initially the holdback, in that when you got to the holdback period, it was changed from 45 days to 60 days. And the intent of that was to allow you to evaluate the work, like the work gets evaluated, substantial performance is issued, the lien period starts. But with the 60-day period being extended from 45, under the Act, you now have within the first, before 45 days, if you discover that there's more incomplete work that you find that hasn't been done, or you're not getting the documentation that's required, you can then formally put a notice out to the contractor that you're not going to pay the whole back. You're going to reduce the amount of pullback that you're going to give them, or you're not going to give them any of it. And that now is a formal process for adjusting that payment. You have to give them cause, and you have to give them the values as to why you're holding a specific amount back, but at least it gives you a legitimate method of adjusting the payment so that all of the funds aren't released. In the next scenario, same contract, in October of 2019, the second phase of the Construction Act came into place, which is the introduction of a proper invoice, which defined what the contractor had to give you in order to submit their invoice. In this same change, it took away the requirement for the contractor to send you a draft to review in the first place. So that became a bit of a problem. With the timelines changed, it changed it so that you could, because you didn't have a chance to review the invoice, as long as they met the requirements of a proper invoice, you had to receive it. It still allowed us to not recommend full payment, but again, it introduced a similar condition as to what was introduced for the release of holdback, where you can send a notice to the contractor saying you don't agree with their claim, and the owner's not going to pay the full amount. And again, you give cause and value for it. And then the contractor gets the reduced payment. When you get through to the substantial performance stage of the project, there's really no change. It carries on with the 60-day lien period. So the takeaway on this change item is that the introduction of the proper invoice eliminates delays in accepting the contractor's invoice, but it introduces a process for releasing a partial payment with cause, and it extends it gives you a fixed time period of the 28 days. Final scenario now is with the introduction of the CCDC 2020, which is done to coordinate the documents with the new Construction Act. And with that introduction, it splits out the substantial performance requirement from a dollar value and substantial performance from being able to operate on the property, the ready for use condition of it. So in this scenario, with the if there is a dispute about I guess going back a bit, sorry, on the lien portion, if there is a dispute towards the end of the project for substantial performance, often the submission of documentation was used as a leverage to sort of delay the payment or slow down the process. With the introduction of the CCDC 2020, this has been removed by introduction of ready for takeover, which separates the dollar value for substantial performance for the work completed on the project and the actual documentation process and completion of the physical work. So the substantial performance portion is released the same as it has been previously, but at the same time, you assess the value of the work, you assess the documentation, assign it a cost, and that becomes a ready for takeover procedure. So it's sort of a duplication of the holdback process, but done after substantial to do the final closeout. So in this case, the contractor is required to send their invoice to the consultant at the same time that they send it to the owners. The introduction of ready for takeover removes the requirement for receipt of final documentation from substantial. And it also revises the time period for the release of the holdback from immediately following the release of the holdback to 10 days after the release of holdback. And that change allows the owners to actually do the lien check that they're required to do before they have to release the money. Previously, releasing the money the day after the holdback expired, there really wasn't time to do a lien search within the timelines that they gave you. So I guess the takeaway is that through the progression of the different documents, the intent has been to try and make sure that the owners get paid, or the contractors get paid on time, while still allowing the owners to review the values and to make sure that all of the documentation and everything is received in a timely manner at the end of the project.
Thanks, Mike. And I think Jim put something in the chat box, and I think that's probably also a good takeaway just by the virtue of his question. He says, if a portion of the holdback is to be held back, I presume that this would be determined and coordinated by the project manager engineer, hence advising the contractor. Is this an accurate assumption? Would you say that's an accurate assumption, Mike?
Just trying to, could you repeat that quickly again?
Yeah, he says that if a portion of the holdback is to be held back, I presume that this would be determined and coordinated by the project manager engineer. And that's probably another good takeaway, is that in terms of this process, and that it's probably a good idea to have some professionals advising you through this process as well.
Yes, yeah, it is evaluated by the consultant or the owner as to, this is the cause part, you have to provide them in the notice. When you say you're not going to release all of the holdback, you can't do it arbitrarily. There has to be a fixed item of work or quantity of work that you disagree with, and you have to assign it a specific dollar value so that it's transparent. The Act itself doesn't actually recognize consultants. It always deals directly with the owners, but the CCDC contracts are where you get the provision of the owner allowing the consultant to work on their behalf.
Thanks, Mike. And, as things always get more complicated when they make changes to legislation, it's always good to use your professionals, make sure that you're following the new rules that are in place. All right, so let's move on to our next case study. And we have Michele Farley with us, and she's always got good stories. So Michele, notices of violation. And I think your case study is about what not to do when you get that notice of a violation, right?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sonja.
We're all on the edge of our seat. We're paying attention. We're taking notes. What happened?
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I present my lessons learned case study, I wanted to overview a few things that many of you have heard me speak about over the last several webinars and over the years. The Fire Code covers a wide variety of compliance measures that apply to your condo. In most cases, only about 50% of the regular life safety system maintenance, inspections, and tests are conducted by your service providers. That leaves close to half of your compliance obligations to be performed and recorded by supervisory staff or management or the board of directors. You are not fire code experts, nor are you expected to be. It is important to know and understand your obligations under the fire code. All supervisory staff, managers, and board members should be clear and properly trained on their fire code responsibilities. And where you're not clear or sure, you should rely and reach out to your experts. The importance of this will be evident in the case I'm about to discuss. So let's begin. The case I want to talk about today is of a supervisory staff and a board of directors taking the wrong steps in responding to a warning by the fire department. At this building, the fire department came in to do a fire code compliance assessment and found that there were multiple fire code deficiencies, which they informed the building of, telling them these issues needed to be fixed immediately. This was a fire department warning, and the superintendent said he would inform the manager right away. When the fire department returned, they found these fixes had not been completed and proceeded to issue the building a notice of violation. which generally provides you about 30 days to comply before the fire inspector returns. The board decided to give the notice of violation to their fire alarm company and asked them to take care of all of the deficiencies. So remember that as we go through this. The board thought the work would just all get done. However, over half the deficiencies had nothing to do with the fire alarm service company and included things like fire doors not latching, fire separations being damaged, and items piled up or stored in areas that they're not allowed to be. When the fire department came back again to check on the progress of the notice of violation deficiencies, the building super told them the work was being completed by their service company and it would be finished in a couple of weeks. Then the board put pressure on the service company to get all this work done right away. When the fire department returned yet again, yes, this is inspection number 3, they found that a lot of the fire alarm related work was completed. Smoke alarms, CO detectors, fire alarm devices, sprinkler, and even extinguishers had been completed, but there were no records on site of the work being done, and nothing else on the list had been touched. This is when the fire department issued an inspection order. The board should have asked for help, but they continued to try to resolve all of the items on their own. In fact, the fire contractor even filled holes in fire separations and did some of the fire door repair work. The next time the fire department returned, most of the fire separation work was still incomplete, and in some cases, the fire contractor did not use proper fire-rated materials. The work had to be redone. The fire department issued another inspection order, this time to the corporation and the property manager and the management firm. The board should have asked for help right away, but they didn't. They continued to try to resolve everything on their own and with their fire alarm contractor, who wasn't qualified to help them through all of the deficiencies. And the manager had to follow the instructions of the board. They ended up with a summons to appear in court. This is when they reached out to FCS and their legal counsel for help. Last minute, in a panic. We immediately began resolving the deficiencies properly and preparing to negotiate lower fines before the court. By this time, any leniency and good faith we can usually rely on from the fire department was long gone. The inspector was frustrated and felt he had provided ample time for compliance, and he had. This process had extended over many, many months. He had been patient, but that patience was exhausted by the time we were called in. We worked really fast, did a fire code audit, got authorization to get the right contractors in, and achieved compliance in a matter of weeks. But the inspector and the prosecutor were persistent, and now the matter was a legal one. So, what should the board have done? The first thing the board should have done was to immediately begin to resolve the deficiencies when the fire department issued them a warning. They may have been able to fix the deficiencies and ended the process right there. The further documentation would have never been required. If they had resolved all the deficiencies with the right qualified contractors from the beginning, once they had received the notice of violations, the board would never have received the notice of violation. And they would have been able to see right from the beginning what the contractor could and couldn't do. And at that point, be able to get the other contractors in that was outside the scope of the fire alarm company. Next, they should have asked those contractors what they could get done and how long it would take. Could they do all the work in 2 or 3 weeks period, sign off on it, provide the paperwork, and get it completed so the board could prove progress to the fire department when they returned? This would have allowed the board to ask for more time when the fire department came back because they would have been able to show the progress that they were making. It also would have helped the board to identify the work to be done by professional fire door and separation companies, as well as the 2 or 3 complex fire code issues that their fire alarm contractors were not qualified to address, and they really needed additional professional fire consultant help with. If the board had taken these steps, they may have been able to stop the process from escalating to an inspection order and then a summons to appear. The original fines requested by the prosecutor totaled upwards of $70,000. Without including the cost of resolving any of the deficiencies, that was all on top. Between legal counsel and FCS, we were able together to reduce the fines to less than $20,000, which still could have been avoided if the board had taken proper actions right away. So what are the lessons learned here? One, do your best to always keep your buildings fire code compliant. But really, secondly, treat any warning or inspection order from the fire department, notice a violation, like an emergency. The fire department compliance clock starts ticking on the first visit. The third thing is to break down the deficiencies identified as quickly as you can, find out what can be done by your incumbent service providers and where you're going to need additional qualified parties or professional help. And the last thing, make an action plan that can be completed swiftly. By maintaining your building's fire code compliance and addressing any fire inspector visits as an emergency, you can prevent the escalation of fire code deficiencies and enforcement. And most importantly, keep your buildings and your people safe. Thank you, Sonja.
Thanks, Michelle. Listening to you, I always come up with this saying in my head. It's like, know your limits and stay within it. Right. And, we aren't,
I love that.
We aren't experts on everything. Sorry. We have certain things that have expertise on. It's like me trying to, fix my toilet. I'll probably make the repair cost about 100 times more than if I just brought the plumber in the first place. And so saving money up front, as you explained in this scenario, costs the corporation a ton more money down the road. And, we can take that lesson and apply it across a variety of different examples. But thanks again for sharing your stories and for sharing your tips. And as always, it's really important to get the right professionals in at the front end. It probably will save you money at the end of the day. And I think that might be a common theme we might be hearing from some other case stories a little bit later on. All right, so moving on to our next panelist is Jon Juffs, who's also a great storyteller. And Jon, you're going to talk to us about balcony repairs, but I have a feeling that the lesson learned from this may not just apply to balconies, right?
Well, that's a good assumption there, Sonja. This is a story about being penny wise and pound foolish. So a few years ago, a condominium corporation that was constructed in 1975, so they were about 42 years old at the time, noticed that they needed to do something with their balconies. And so they did the right thing. They got a condition assessment done by consultant number one and got the pricing in. The pricing came in at about $6,000 a balcony back then, which is fairly typical. There's nothing special about this building. It's a big rectangle with about 108 balconies, and they're all the same size, and they're all, from second floor to 12th floor. So it seemed to be about the right price. And consultant number one said, it'd be around $6,000 a balcony, and that tender it to find out. They tendered it, and it came in just a little bit under 6,000 at around 5,800. And so, great, get on. They had the money in reserve. They'd been saving up all this time. They get on with the work, and then the board changes. And for whatever reason, the board had decided to do the north side first. Everybody who got onto the new board of directors at the next AGM was from the north side of the building. And they were extremely unhappy with the noise and the conditions and everything, and of course, the cost. So they immediately fired everyone, got consultant number two, and consultant number two said, well, you've already done the north side. All there is the south side. And, I'll see if I can get some good pricing for you. Consultant number two tenders, and those tenders come in at anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000 a balcony. They fire him, and the board says, I know a guy. And the board goes out and gets a guy, and the guy comes in and says, yeah, I can probably do that for about $3,700 a balcony, $200,000 project, $3,700 for the 54 on the south side. Bear in mind that they knew full well that from the north side, it cost around about $5,800 a balcony. So they had this great price, $3,700. Consultant number three survives all the fire and brimstone, except they realize, wow, the work being done on the south side is nowhere near like the work we got on the north side. And bear in mind, the board of directors were all from the north side. They get turfed at the next AGM, and south side owners get in. South side owners say, we're not paying for any of this, despite having certificates of payment from consultant number three saying, well, some of it's acceptable. You got to pay for some. And this gets to Mike's point about being transparent and making sure that you're, following all the construction guidelines. And we're also now into the pandemic. And we're well into 2020 with this work going on. And then the board says to manager, go out and find another better consultant. And the manager says, we're kind of running out of consultants. We're on consultant number 3, and it's not that big an industry. Consultant number 4, yours truly, gets hired to come and look at all the deficient work on the south side and explain why they shouldn't have to pay a penny. So consultant number 4 says, some of this work looks acceptable, and it is fixing an old building, right? You're not getting a brand new building. And they say, yeah, but it doesn't look anything like the north side. And I said, well, yeah, because you're not paying for the same quality of materials or workers as you did on the north side. And they said, no, that's not acceptable. A contract's a contract is a contract. And I said, well, that's very true. I said, but do you really want to spend, thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting over this when it's a $200,000 project? And they said, no, we're not going to throw good money after bad. How much to get the south side to look like the north side? So we just tendered it this week, and the tenders have come in at about $3,000. I think it's $2,900. So about $200 to $800 more per balcony. So at the end of the day, this corporation will have spent very close to $6,900 or possibly $7,500 per balcony on the south side compared to the original $5,800 that they had. Everybody says they were doing it with best intentions, but I think in this case, their intentions were misguided. Their intentions were to slash costs no matter what. And that comes with consequences. You give up if you can only have price, quality, and speed. If you don't care how long it takes and you don't want to pay any money, well, you're going to get pretty poor quality, and so on, through the various combinations of those 3 things of price, quality, and speed. The other thing was, don't expect perfection. When you're fixing, that old balcony, it's going to look like a fixed old balcony. It's not going to look like a brand new one across the street. Be wary of prices that are too good to be true, and set reasonable expectations for everybody in the process. I mean, even the property manager is on the brink of giving up this otherwise long-standing client because of all the frustrations of dealing with these back and forth and cost-cutting stuff. The tendering process in Ontario exists for a reason. It's to get the best possible value for the money spent. It is not to get the cheapest product. Certainly choosing products wisely can have some effect on it, but you have to look at the total process. And to be on consultant number 4 and still having their doubts, I mean, they're even, writing stern letters to us about, what bad advice we're giving them. Eventually you got to look at the sum total of all the correspondence that you have and say, maybe we're getting the advice that's right, because pretty consistently all 4 consultants are saying the same thing over and over again to this board. So we'll see how this plays out, and I'll let you know if I'm crying in my beer on the weekend of or not of getting fired from this project. But those are the key takeaways. Don't expect perfection. Be wary of prices that are too good to be true. Try to not get yourself in a situation like they found themselves, where they ended up paying more at the end of the day than they ever would have had if they'd stuck with the original team. And just be reasonable, because that is what the act requires of you. Thanks, Sonja.
Thanks, John. And I guess, the one takeaway word or 2 words from that is about managing expectations, right? Because the unrealistic expectations ended up costing this condo more, and may even end up with another consultant, which is only going to just add costs to the whole project at the end of the day, and you're still not going to be happy. So managing your own expectations, managing the expectations of the owners, and listening to your consultants. You're paying for professionals to provide you with advice.
Yeah, if you're paying for professional advice, you do very well to heed by it. The other thing too is, don't fall victim. Like, the community elected these people on the promise that they would do all this work for less money, and of course that promise has not been realized. It's actually costing more. So it's a very difficult situation to be in, but try to avoid that whole elect me, I'm going to run this corporation on less money.
Yeah, that's where managing the owner expectations come in.
Exactly.
Prices are going up. They're not going down on everything. So we got to be realistic. Thanks, John. All right, so now we are moving over to our president of CCI Huronia, Debbie Dale, and she's going to talk to us again. This theme keeps coming up about bringing in the right expertise, listening to the expertise, and some consequences when you don't. So, Debbie, you want to share your case study and your lessons?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much, Sonja. I don't know how you managed to put all the right pieces of this webinar together, but if somebody watches this from start to finish, tons of great information. The property I wanted to talk about today is a townhouse development. It's just over 20 years old now. They self-managed for a period of time, and then someone on the board found a friend that had nothing to do. He'd been semi-retired and decided to take on the role of management, all of course before the new licensing for managers came into place. I call this the site with problems that knew no boundaries. And I hate to describe it as that, but we are 4 years into it and it's a lovely property now. My firm was retained as manager just as the snow landed one year, about 4.5 years back. And we landed in some interesting situations in that very first winter. Additions were found to have been built once we looked at the architectural drawings for the townhouses, but we could find no Section 98 agreements in any of the unit files that are required to permit changes or additions to the common elements. To make this discovery a lot more complex or a larger problem than we already encountered, there were no consents in place from the original developer of the property to have added on to any of the units. We then learned that there was documents, of course, in the condominium governing documents that required owners to get consent of the developer before they could add on to their units. And the reason for that was that the gross floor area that was added on to each unit in this corporation was then deducted from the gross floor area that the developer could build on their adjoining lands. We're into about $40,000 in legal and planner fees to date, and the matter is still unresolved. Winter 1 landed there. An addition completely collapsed, or rather caved in January, leading to a full demolition of that addition at great expense to the unit owner. During that process, we were on site regularly, of course, and noticed massive icicles hanging off of the roofs and landing on walkways as the spring hit there. And the pattern over the years at that property was to install signs that said, "Beware falling ice overhead." A roof and attic review was finally conducted in the spring once the board, a little bit of arm twisting, agreed that they would conduct same with an engineer. I wanted to take a look, as did the board, at their extremely expensive 1-year-old roof, which had been installed with no support of any engineering. At the management level, we had already noted a variety of visible material install errors with a very lovely and expensive lifelong tile product that the board chose for its lifespan and to upgrade the property, alongside being able to avoid construction messes in the future. Well, the roofing trade was no longer in business, and the warranty on the improperly installed shingle tiles was voided, as it was installed incorrectly and by a trade that was not an approved installer for that roofing material. $520,000 spent on roofs that would now never perform as needed or as designed. The attic audit was then performed to determine the cause of the severe ice damming and icicles. The engineers found heat sources into the attics, including pot lights not properly sealed, bathroom exhaust fans venting right into attic spaces thanks to unit renovations over time, fireplace chimneys not sealed, inadequate ventilation in the original roof design so as to not allow for adequate ventilation, and even areas where insulation was just simply missing. It was just a mess at that property for a long period of time. Working our way down the structures from top to bottom, the siding at the property, we noticed on our grounds walk-in early the following spring, the wood seemed to be a little soft in some areas. I actually, in over a dozen spots at the property, took my pen and put it into the siding and was able to touch the back surface of the drywall inside the units. Not a good sign. The approach in the past at this particular property was to sand it off every spring, maybe give it some primer and paint over those boards and keep going through another year. The property had extremely high pest control bills over time, and we quickly realized that if I could stick a pen through the siding, the rodents had easily ingress patterns, and in fact, mice and rats and all kinds of lovely creatures tended to crawl in every winter, and the philosophy there was we kill them once they get inside. The findings once the siding was taken apart was that there was no drainage gap behind the siding, so no strapping underneath the wood siding, and the walls were actually collecting moisture and growing mold. The building paper was tucked in behind the sheet metal flashing at the bottom of the walls, thereby trapping or holding moisture right within the wall assembly. So the building paper should have been lapped over the flashing and instead was tucked in behind and secured by the flashing. If somebody had just taken some siding boards off this property 20 years prior, and thus far we're into over $500,000 in wall repairs, they would have seen the problems with the wood siding, and this property would not have spent the money that they did. And of course, you know, I thought at one point, well, let's just put something over this old wood siding. Well, we couldn't because what was underneath it was too severely rotted, and you couldn't just cover it up and move on. And then there was mold. So then we ran into a wonderful thing called rim joist deterioration. So the rim joists, in simple terms, are the structural members that the wall joists sit on. These were so severely rotted in some units that the units themselves had to be structurally supported to allow full replacement of the rim joists. This is expensive. And of course, the interior repairs were then needed because we had drywall affected, and the owners that bought the fancy roof that didn't want to go through construction again, that had drywallers painting drop sheets and mess inside their homes. When it seemed it could only get better, it became worse. Long-term basement leakage escalated. Over the years, some basements had water seepage. So the fix, quote unquote, had been to install sump pumps in the homes, but only when there was significant water in each basement. The cracks in the basement walls were repaired by injection one at a time. That's a result of freeze-thaw cycles not attended to. And an audit of the weeper system, which we finally convinced the board to do, indicated that using a camera scope, the weeper system was 90% blocked with tree roots. So each year, the functionality of that weeper system had declined so as to be worse than the year before. At this stage, this particular site is looking at either interior weepers at a great expense of about $250,000, or exterior weepers, which is digging up everything outside the buildings at a cost of just over $750,000. That does not factor in wall repairs or anything else, of course. So what are the lessons? I would say number one, read your condominium documents and the legislation which is applicable to condominiums in Ontario if you're going to self-manage. If not, hire a qualified, licensed, insured, well-reputed condominium property management firm and use and draw from their expertise. Allowing owners to add on to the units without reading the governing documents that specifically prohibited it created a lot of problems at this property. And I might add, you know, the reputation of this site has not done well over time. If you look at, you know, the icicles, the addition that collapsed, there's been a lot of problems for the poor folks that bought in there. Certainly painting annually after a quick sanding is not a good strategy when you have siding problems. And if you look at the money that was spent there on the defects that could have been found earlier, you know, I would say at this property, they lost an excess of $500,000 in not wanting to spend $10,000 on a destructive audit to determine what the problems were and how to fix them. And of course, icicles and ice damming. You know, I'm up in Muskoka. It's not normal in Muskoka, let alone anywhere else. If there's a lot of icicles and ice damming, there is a problem. Have an engineer take a look at how the structure is functioning, especially before you replace the roof. Putting new shingles on a faulty roof will not facilitate achieving the proper lifespan. When you install a new roof, there is an absolutely golden opportunity there to consider change and improvement to ventilation, insulation, putting ice and water shield further up the roof, and doing so much more. A proper tender with specifications drafted by an engineer with a background in building sciences will lead to success with qualified bidders and the correct materials. And a big hint here, I have learned in 30 plus years, the good engineering firms know who the good trades are. So when a well-executed set of specifications is issued to the market, a good engineering firm will bring in great trades. You'll get decent prices. And honestly, the cheapest trade is just not the best trade. Shop carefully. Final lesson, water seepage into basements and crawl spaces is a problem. It's not normal. And guess what? It's not even an insurable loss. When the cause is not identified, then structural damage takes place with repeated freeze and thaw cycles over the years. And injecting a product into cracks in the walls is not a repair, but a Band-Aid. Had a weeper inspection been done years before, they could have addressed the growing tree root issues, preserved the weeper systems that were there at point of construction, avoided the seepage, flooding, wall cracking, and saved a ton of money. In closing, I would say spending the money, bring in the experts, because Band-Aid fixes just don't hold long-term and cost you more. The silver lining, this particular board and management now have a great working relationship. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Sonja.
Thanks, Debbie. It's nice to know there's a silver lining in that story. My head is just shaking. It's funny because our last webinar, Kevin Shaw took us through sort of some things that if you saw them, they would kind of give you a heads up that you need to do some further investigation. And your case study today is a perfect example of where having done that investigation at the time when you saw some hints of problems would have saved a ton of money. And it's just the amount of money that's been spent is just, oh my goodness. I'm sure that board had a lot of explaining to do to the owners, and that was probably not a fun meeting. So thanks again, Debbie, for sharing that. And speaking of money, we're going to move over to Blair Spinney, who is a member of the board of directors for CCI Huronia, who's an auditor. And, it's interesting when I was getting this webinar organized and I was talking to Blair about what he was going to talk about as his case study, I was blown away that this could even exist. So I'm going to leave you with that suspense, and I'm going to pass it off to Blair. And Blair, give us some background on your case study. And I think people will be surprised when they hear the lesson that needs to be learned from it. Blair?
Thank you, Sonja. Unfortunately, I think you've built this up to be far more entertaining than it will be. Accounting and auditing are just definitely not up there as far as with the stories that management and the engineers have. So in any case, I will jump into it. I do have, since it is auditing and accounting, I am going to share my screen or attempt to do so. Okay, so that's the one I want. All right, so now I do believe I have it on everybody's screen that wants to have a look.
You're good, Blair.
So that looks good. So this is a 95% fictional case, and you can tell that by the nice round numbers here. So here we have excerpts from financial statements for the year ended December 31, 2020. So right up to date here. So this corporation has 100,000 in operating cash, 100,000 in the reserve cash, 900,000 in reserve investments, and no liabilities. Lo and behold, isn't that a perfect scenario? So here they have, a very good looking financial position. We have some of the notes to the financial statements here. We've got the investments, so they've got GICs that are getting actually 2% and 4%, which is probably not realistic. We have a note here about the reserve fund. So if we look here, we see that they have $134,000 was what they said they would put in the reserve fund, and that's the exact amount they put in. and the reserve fund has a projected balance of $1 million. Lo and behold, that's the actual amount in the reserve fund. And small increases in the future, and even a decrease in the future for the reserve fund. So the next thing we have here is the independent auditor's report. So the first paragraph is, of course, the opinion on the financial statements. And here we'll see that the statements present fairly in all material respects of financial position. So that's the good news audit report. The next paragraph here, the basis for the opinion, the auditor discloses that he's independent of the corporation and that he's followed all the ethical guidelines and he's obtained sufficient audit evidence to support his report. Other matters, here is a description of the involvement with the Condominium Corporation Act. The next paragraph is responsibilities of management and the board of directors. So management is actually responsible for the financial statements, and the board of directors is responsible for overseeing the reporting process. Next, we have the auditor's responsibilities, and it kind of gives a little bit of what it is and what it is not. It's not a guarantee, but it's a high level of assurance. And then it gets into the new audit report that came out, excuse me, about 5 years ago now, talks about some of the procedures and the approach that the auditor uses. It's a risk-based audit, and this part of the audit report is a very good part of the report, just to understand what the auditor does. If you ever have doubts about, why is he asking me that, or why is she asking me that, just take a look here, and it might help give you some guidelines here. So all in all, very good. Looks like a very good financial situation. But the bad news is, a month ago there was a large collapse in the roof, and there caused structural damage to the building, and it was going to cost millions of dollars that weren't foreseen in the reserve fund study. So you're probably saying, Blair, how could that actually happen? And this is, of course, the fictitious part. Well, if you might recall, when we were looking here, the obvious answer, or obvious to a lot of you, is that here, it looks like we've got a very good financial position here, but the reserve fund study had not been done since 2013. So that, of course, we all know that the reserve fund study should be updated every 3 years. In this case, we're at 7 years, because this is the year end 2020. So this is something that, if the unit owners were looking at this, and we're not getting into exactly what the board's involvement would be here. Maybe the board didn't realize they had to do it, or maybe they just felt that it wasn't really necessary. They knew the building. They weren't relying on the experts. And there was nothing from the auditor on this. So here's an alternative report that might come out. This is no different. Opinion, basis of opinion. Other matters, this part is taken out. So this actual audit report is an actual, I said this was 95% fictitious. This is an actual audit report format used by at least one firm that I know of. So here is another way to do it. The other matters concerning the Condo Act matter is not there, but at the bottom here, report on other legal and regulatory requirements. So it's required by Section 67(4) of the Condo Act. I report that the corporation has not conducted a reserve fund study within 3 years, and that this is not in accordance with the requirements of Section 94 of the Act and Regulation 48/01. So this is a situation where a lot of auditors would be disclosing this. So this is definitely a question that should be asked. So I guess to sum it all up here, the takeaways are, one, the obvious is make sure your reserve fund study is up to date. The second thing is to read the financial statements, just to make sure that because they are management's financial statements, and the auditor actually relies on management and the board for input into the audit process. And sometimes, you're not really sure what the auditor's doing or what's in the notes. You should agree with making sure that it's A, correct, and B, complete, that it's got everything in there that it should be. So that's another takeaway is to make sure you read the audit report and the financial statements and the notes. The third thing is to ask your auditor, what kind of work are you doing in accordance with the Condominium Act? If there is a discrepancy or something in contravention of the Act, are you going to be reporting that? That's something that maybe you want to talk to your auditor about. And I think in general, we've been saying all throughout the seminar is to rely on your expert. But at the same time, it's a good idea to ask questions and making sure that the communication line is open and that all the information they need is going to them and back and forth that way. So I think that's an important thing to take that way as well. Thank you, and I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Blair. And, I think that last comment you made there is really important. We do say to rely on your professionals, but that doesn't mean that you can't question them as well to make sure that they're doing their job. And when you explained to me that one audit report, which is an actual audit report, that is true, that they basically contracted out of any obligation to inform owners about something as simple as that the reserve fund study wasn't up to date, is quite shocking. And, if I was a condominium owner or a condominium board, I wouldn't want an auditor like that, because the auditor's job is to be that independent look at the financials and look at what's happening in the condo. And they're there to really, represent the owners. They're there on the owner side, taking a look at this. And so it's a bit scary to think that there are some auditors out there who are just washing their hands and saying, we're not going to even give you any heads up on it, when really that should be their job. So pay attention to those notes, as Blair said in the auditor's report. Well, we're about 10 after 1. And if you've stuck around, you're going to be able to listen to our bonus case study. And even Blair's surprised there. See, I told you I'm going to get you guys on the edge of your seats. So we're very lucky because one of our sponsors, Elia Associates and Patricia Elia, who's also a member of our board of directors, is going to share our bonus case study. So for those that have stuck around after 1, here's your bonus case study. Patricia?
Oh, well, thanks very much, Sonja. Good to see everybody here. And this case study I'm going to call The Dangers of Failing to Engage in Reality. And it really brings together a lot of the advice that you've been hearing from the professionals speaking today. And I'm picture it a small building with cantilevered balconies. Now that should be a troublesome concept right there. The cantilever and that design issue for the engineers in the room. Cantilevers are a great idea, but they actually build exactly, right? Thanks, John. See, John is excellent. He can actually help me out here. But cantilevers mean that it goes and it's built into the building. There's a significant component that you do not see that's embedded in the building. So this corporation, unfortunately, had a set of cantilevered balconies that did not function well and were rotting. Okay, so in order to correct a cantilever balcony, though, you need to go into the building and pull it all out, take out the ceilings. It's a huge undertaking. So nobody could agree on doing this, and it was expensive. It was like $3,800 a balcony. Okay, so this went back and forth. Boards change. Picture it now. They put in a potential solution, which is putting up pillars. Well, pillars didn't really work, unfortunately. And again, back and forth, back and forth. And there were clear opinions on how to fix it, but nobody liked the price. And so then 20 years later, somebody falls through the balcony up to their knees because this issue has still not been rectified because nobody can agree. And the cost has gone from $3,800 to now $17,000 a balcony, and it has to be fixed. The corporation doesn't have enough money in its reserve fund to have anticipated that cost, and other projects are mounting, paving, roofing, and not everything can get done. So again, the ongoing debate with the owners is how are we going to pay for it? And people were saying, well, maybe there's another way. Well, finally, the board had to engage, their lawyers, their property managers, their engineers to say, enough already. We've got to get this done. We've got liability issues here that are continually mounting. And to the credit of the corporation, they decided not to go with the special assessment, and they decided to put in place borrowing to bring all of their projects up to the standard that's required to protect them from occupiers' liability issues. So, that's sort of the silver lining here, is that the community finally saw the light and decided to undertake everything. Unfortunately, took about 20 years to do that, which is to me a little bit too long in terms of managing risk. And, they did expose themselves to a lot of a risk potentially along the way. They're just lucky that person, stopped at their knee when they fell through the balcony. But what had happened if they had crashed through the 3 other levels below them? These are the things we need to think about. And, we've seen in the Miami condo case, that kind of dialogue was going on between the owners and the board. And, there's a point, I think, where directors are really the leaders of the corporation. They have a job to do. It's not always going to be easy. I appreciate that. As a director myself, it's not always easy. But I think this is where figuring out the right path, putting your engineering opinions in place, not changing opinions or opinion shopping. I mean, Jon's example was, a real challenge in my mind, because I'm thinking about all the construction law issues that are in between all those consultants. Who do you blame if somebody did something wrong on the north side, then somebody new did something wrong on the south side? You just put all that math together, and we're spending more money than what we should. Like, we really need to figure out how to de-escalate our risk, de-escalate our conflict, and rely on our professionals to be embedded in our process so we can manage the risk proactively. So that would be my takeaway. I think we need to engage in reality and take the facts as they truly are. Thanks.
Thanks, Patricia. And, as you pointed out, that the directors, they're in that place where sometimes they just have to make those tough decisions. And it's not about discussing it forever and ever and ever, because sometimes you just got to make that decision and move on and get your professionals in place. So thanks for sharing, and thanks for that bonus tip, Patricia. All right, so we are just at 1:15, and we have a bit of time for questions, which we don't always have on our webinars. So if anybody has any questions, we've got a panel of experts here that are willing to answer those questions. You can raise your hand by just pressing the reactions button, and then there's the raise hand function. You can also post your question in the chat box, and we can read it out loud. Patricia, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do, actually. I would like to ask Blair a question, because, to me, the financial statements, we go through them at AGMs, and I was recently at an AGM where I was acting for a requisition group to remove members of the board, but it happened to be at an AGM. And what concerned me is that there wasn't enough highlighting of how offside the board was in not updating its reserve fund. The candidates, as I listened to the speeches, were promising reductions in common expenses, right? Which to me is like, where is this condo? Because I just don't know where the costs are going down. But the reserve fund had been offside, according to the requirements, for over 3 years, for at least 5. So Is there something that we should be expecting our auditors to be doing at our AGMs in terms of highlighting real concerns? Like, would you expect to say something at the AGM?
Now it depends on. I think maybe it depends when what you mean by being offside. Were they late on their study, or just not enough money in the reserve fund?
Sorry, say that again.
Sorry, was you say they were offside on the reserve fund, but was it just a matter of not having the projected amount in the reserve fund, or was it a matter of them not having updated their study, like in my case?
They had both. But the thing is,
Oh.
how would you know what the numbers were if the study wasn't updated?
Yeah, no, well, like if the numbers aren't exactly what is projected, that's sort of that happens a fair amount because of the timing of the expenditures. So say you're in year 2 of your study, and an expenditure that wasn't planned to come out until year 5, they bumped it up because things deteriorated faster than they expected. Then that they might have done that earlier than planned, and that would have thrown their balance way below what was projected. So
yeah, but don't you need the reality of the numbers?
Yeah, because that does come up a lot in AGMs. Like, okay, it is lower, and when that happens, and if I'm going to the AGM, it's not my job to explain that difference. But I warn the board. I say, you know what, someone might ask this question, and you should know the answer. That like why is it that much lower? Oh, it's because we did XYZ 2 years ago. They should have that answer ready when it comes up, or they should volunteer it if they're giving their own report.
But the auditor is there to highlight what the benchmarks are under the Act, right, for the benefit of the owners.
Actually, that's sort of. I mean, that's sort of. There's a bit of a debate in our world, because we're there for the owners. We report to the owners, but we're really reporting on the audit and generalities about the financial statements. We wouldn't normally. Like, our job is not to get into the management decisions and say why things were done, or that's probably a level of detail that management should be, or the board
prepared to answer.
And I do think you might be able to know more about this than I do, but I think some of the proposed changes to the Act are kind of have some of the stuff in mind, like more of a reconciliation between what I showed in my chart there, more of a reconciliation between, okay, here's what the reserve fund projection is, and here's the reality. I think there's some of that in some of the, I'm not sure on that, maybe you know more. I think some of that's in some of the proposed changes to the Act.
Well, yeah, I think those things are coming. I don't think that all those changes are there yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, if I could just jump on that, the recommendations from a few years ago, I guess it was 2017, included a very detailed reserve budget report. So study called for these things to be done, board actually did these things to be done, and then an explanation as to why there might be any difference. It's more work, and it's certainly more work for auditors and for boards, but it is that level of transparency where things like the one that Blair showed us don't happen, where, people just shrug their shoulders and say, well, the balance is the balance and everything seems to be okay. But how did you get to that balance matters, not sometimes the destination isn't as important as the journey, and how we got to that $1 million in the example mattered, right?
Yeah. If I could jump in as well as an intern for that, sometimes what we've done on a large project is done a small version of a financial update to the reserve fund at the time that what the project costs are going to be, so that everyone, if it knows up front, if they have to start massaging and adjusting their reserve fund, they know about it before they get in too far into it.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, I see Debbie had a question. Debbie, do you still have a question you want to put out there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just getting back a couple of comments ago, someone talked about, relying on your experts. And From a property management perspective, I know it's difficult, but a really short one here. I have a client who's got a whole bunch of, complex issues, as many of the older properties in Northern Ontario do. So they've hired a lawyer, great condominium lawyer. They've hired a fire safety consultant, great fire safety consultant. They've hired an engineer, great engineer. I think my company does a pretty good job of property management services. But this particular client hasn't trusted all of the experts to talk amongst themselves and put together a program and present it to the board. The board doesn't want, A, B, C, D talking to each other unless the board knows about it, because the board has all these ideas of their own. And sometimes I run into clients that, although you'd love to manage them, they're not manageable. So word to the wise, if you're spending the money on experts, just try and rely on them and see where it goes, and catch up with the flow over time. I really think it'll suit well. Thanks for allowing me to share that thought.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. I know in my experience, dealing with clients that try to micromanage usually end up incurring more costs than if they would just let the professionals who know what they're doing do what they're recommending be done. And that micromanaging, is just another example of where costs start to escalate and things go offside. We had a question in the chat that I think kind of got answered in the chat box, but I know not everybody gets to see the chat box. So I was thinking I just put it out there. We have a couple more minutes left. And this is for you, Michele. This was a question from Catherine, who is a longtime supporter of our webinars. And she said, I live in a townhouse complex, no fire plan to date. Tried to get a fire safety presentation to all owners for years. It always falls off the map. And I bring it back on again. Our owners are responsible to monitor their smoke and fire alarms, but as some owners are only here part-time and don't care, how do we get this on track? So Michele, any tips for our audience in terms of what can a condo in this type of situation do to try and get that presentation for owners, which is probably a good idea to have?
It's a great question. And the answer is serve wine and cheese.
Food and drink.
It's worked in more condos than I can count.
That's true.
But they also mentioned that they have some absentee owners, which is very common, especially in a lot of our region where there's a lot of resort properties and that type of thing as well. The rules are in place for specific reasons, but I've had boards, even in condominium complexes, that have had ongoing issues with people keeping their smoke alarms up to date, their CO detectors up to date, even managing the junk in their backyard if they've got a small sliding patio door, or properly following the rules in that regard, having a lot of combustibles stacked up against the condo, which can be a risk. And there are ways to change that the condominium can change rules and say, we're going to come in once a year and check your smoke alarms and CO detectors. But I would always start with trying to have fire safety seminars, and maybe just either record it so they can see it, or send out another short, summary out to people. It can go more than once a year. It can go in the AGM package. It can go in a separate mail out. These days we have email, but the big challenge here is you probably have renters and owners. And in many, many cases, we see the renters getting the information, but not the owners getting the information. So sometimes they don't even know. So I'd start by trying to plan some sort of a fun event for fire safety, circulate something, keep recommending. But if they're really suffering, that's a risk to the whole building. Smoke and fire are migratory. They don't stay in the boundaries of the firewalls between your units. And if you really have a problem, it might be a rule or a policy you might want to look at and change. The fire code's the minimum standard, and you can always say, this isn't working. We need some compliance measures here. Even if it's a one-time audit and correction, take some steps that way. But the fire department will also sometimes come to the building for presentations. So you might be able to pull something together, but if you can't, do something to be proactive on the board's behalf. Show those records.
All right. Thanks, Michele. Well, we're at 25 after 1, so I think we've got to wrap it up. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank our great panel of speakers and our surprise speaker, Patricia. Thanks for joining us. And our sponsors. So Integrity Property Management, SCS Fire Consulting Services, and Elia Associates Condominium Lawyers. Thank you again for sponsoring and being continuing sponsors of our webinars. As I indicated at the beginning of this session, the webinar is being recorded and a recording will be available on our website next week. Mark your calendars for upcoming events. We have our November 19th Lunch and Learn webinar, which is going to be talking about technology in condos. On December 17th, which is our last webinar for the year, we are going to have our legal panel and case law update webinar. All details about our upcoming events can be found on our website, ccihuronia.com. I also want to make sure that everyone is aware of the upcoming national conference, which is on November 13th. It is going to be held virtually, and the conference is going to be talking about adapting to change. And if you've been to any of our previous webinars in the past, you will know Dr. Sin. She's been on our COVID webinars, and she is actually our keynote speaker for the CCI National Conference on November 13th. And I know lots of people enjoyed listening to her. So if you want to listen a little bit more to Dr. Sin, definitely come and check out the national conference. I've just shared the screen. This is our CCI national page, cci.ca, and you can just click on the national conference, and that's how you can easily register. And here's a little message from Dr. Sin.
Hi, have you ever noticed how in the Marvel movies, the superheroes like Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, and Thor always seem to have the ability to bounce back from all sorts of setbacks? Wouldn't you like to be able to tap into that superpower of resiliency so that you can bounce back from all the accumulated frustrations as property managers or board directors, or even in your personal lives? Happiness and resilience are skills, and just like any other skill, they can be developed. I'm Dr. Mabel Sin, and I am your keynote speaker at the National CCI Conference. I'll be talking to you about the second pandemic. And no, I'm not referring to the pandemic of COVID-19. I'm referring to the pandemic of chronic stress and burnout, which is ripping through our country. Drawing data from neuroscience, psychology, and medicine, you will discover how to bust burnout by changing your physiology. You will learn how to launch proven strategies which you can apply immediately, whether it's in a tense board meeting or having those tough discussions with owners or property management. These tips will help you build resilience so that you can bounce back from the emotional exhaustion that comes from your role as leaders and volunteers. These strategies not only have proven anti-aging effects, but they also improve our immune system, our health, and increase our happiness. So, please join me on November 13th at the National CCI Conference to learn more.
All right, so hopefully we'll see all of you there as we learn how to bust burnout from Dr. Mabel Sin. There's a lot of other great panel discussions. We're going to be talking about hybrid meetings. We're going to be talking about technologies that condos can be using. So join us on November 13th. At the CCI National Conference. You can register online at cci.ca. And if you are a member of a CCI chapter, you would have received an email this morning with a registration link. Also, there are other events coming up at our other chapters across Ontario. CCI Golden Horseshoe has their level 300 course on November 18th. You can go to cci-ghc.ca for more information. CCI Grand River has their session on community and compliance on November 13th. And you can go to cci-grc.ca. CCI London, you can find out about their upcoming events at cci-sw.on.ca. CCI Eastern Ontario has their education extravaganza on October 27th Check that out at cci-easternontario.ca. CCI Toronto has their AGM coming up on October 26th, ccitoronto.org. And CCI Windsor has an insurance webinar on November 17th, cci-windsor.ca. And tomorrow, CCI Northwestern Ontario has a webinar on standard unit insurance and maintenance bylaws and cost recovery. So you can go to NW Ontario at cci.ca for more information. Send them an email. So until next time, I'm Sonja Hodis, and from the entire CCI family to yours, wishing you a good weekend. We hope to see you at our next webinar on November 19th. And don't forget that CCI is your condo connection. Have a great weekend, everyone.